The throne world of Zartholos gleamed like a jewel in the void, its 3 moons casting silver light across palace spires that pierced the clouds. Ambassador Elena Volkov stepped from her diplomatic shuttle onto marble that had been quarried from extinct civilizations, her boots clicking with measured precision as honor guards of the Zartholian Empire snapped to attention. She wore the simple gray suit of the Terran diplomatic corps, no weapons visible, no armor, nothing but a data pad clutched in her aged hands and the weight of Earth's hopes resting on her shoulders. She was 73 years old, her hair silver as starlight, her face lined with decades of negotiation and compromise. The Zartholian guards, towering creatures of chitin and fury who had conquered 17 star systems, looked at her with barely concealed contempt. To them, she was nothing, an old woman from a species barely capable of faster-than-light travel, come to beg for mercy on behalf of her primitive world. They had no idea who she had been before she became a diplomat. They had no idea what name the shadows still whispered when humanity needed someone to do the impossible. King Vorshax the Eternal waited in his throne room, a chamber so vast that weather patterns formed near its vaulted ceiling. He sat upon a seat carved from the skull of a void leviathan, his 4 arms spread in a gesture that might have been welcome but felt more like a predator displaying its reach. Around him, his court gathered in their thousands, alien nobles from 100 conquered worlds, all come to witness the humiliation of humanity. The Terran species had been given an ultimatum 3 months prior: submit to Zartholian rule, surrender 70% of their resources as tribute, and accept imperial governance, or face annihilation. The Zartholian armada currently orbiting Earth's moon made clear this was no idle threat. 2,000 warships, each capable of glassing a continent, waited for the word to begin the bombardment. Ambassador Volkov had requested this audience, had asked for one final chance to plead humanity's case before the king. Vorshax had agreed because he enjoyed these moments, the desperate begging of conquered species, the tears and promises that always preceded submission. He did not know that Elena Volkov had never begged for anything in her life, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. She walked the length of the throne room with her head held high, refusing to be intimidated by the alien grandeur surrounding her. The court whispered as she passed, their translators rendering their mockery in a dozen languages. One noble laughed openly, a sound like breaking glass, and said something about Terran fragility. Elena's expression never changed. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions locked away where they couldn't be used against her, to present a face of absolute calm even when her heart was calculating trajectories and counting exits. She reached the base of the throne and offered a slight bow, just enough to acknowledge protocol but not enough to suggest subservience. Vorshax leaned forward, his primary eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. His translator rendered his words in perfect English, tinged with mockery. He welcomed the representative of Terra, expressed his pleasure at her wisdom in coming to accept his generous terms, and asked if she was prepared to formally surrender her species to his benevolent rule. The court waited for her prostration, for the tears and pleading that always came at this moment. Instead, Elena Volkov smiled. It was a terrible smile, the kind that made the nearest guards unconsciously shift their weight, the kind that carried echoes of things best left forgotten. She said, in a voice that carried clearly despite its softness, that she had not come to surrender. She had come to deliver a counteroffer. The throne room fell silent. Even the weather patterns in the upper atmosphere seemed to pause. Vorshax's amusement curdled into something darker. A counteroffer? From a species that couldn't possibly resist his armada? The arrogance of these Terrans would be their undoing. He gestured with one of his lesser hands for her to speak, already planning how he would make an example of her world for this insult. Elena opened her data pad and began to read, her voice never wavering, laying out humanity's terms with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Humanity would not submit. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would not pay tribute. Instead, the Zartholian Empire would withdraw its fleets from Terran space within 48 hours, would pay reparations for the threat of violence, and would sign a non-aggression pact recognizing human sovereignty. Furthermore, King Vorshak's would personally apologize for the disrespect shown to the Terran people. The court erupted in outrage. Nobles roared and screeched and howled in their various ways. The guards leveled weapons that hummed with lethal energy. But Vorshak simply laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder through the vast chamber. He asked if the old woman had lost her mind, if Terran senility had finally claimed her reason. Did she not understand that he could order her death with a gesture? That he could give the command right now to begin the bombardment of Earth? That her entire species existed only because he had not yet bothered to extinguish it? Elena closed her data pad with a soft click that somehow cut through the chaos. She looked up at the king with eyes that had seen things that would drive most beings to madness, eyes that had watched empires fall and monsters die, eyes that belonged to someone who had spent 30 years of her life doing work so dark that even the governments who employed her refused to acknowledge it existed. She said, in that same soft voice, that he could certainly try to kill her. Many had tried before. She was still here. They were not. Vorshak's had heard enough. The insolence of this creature, this fragile thing of soft flesh and brittle bone, standing in his throne room and threatening him, was beyond tolerance. He made the gesture, the one that meant death, and 6 of his personal guard moved forward with weapons raised. They were the finest warriors in his empire, enhanced with combat drugs and biomodifications, capable of killing in thousands of ways. They advanced on the old woman, expecting her to run or plead or at least show fear. Instead, Elena Volkov set down her data pad carefully, rolled her shoulders once as if working out a kink, and said something in a language that her translator didn't render. It was Russian, Old Russian, a phrase that soldiers had whispered in the frozen trenches of ancient wars. She said, "Okay then. Let's dance." And the Baba Yaga went to work. The first guard died before anyone realized the dance had begun. Elena moved like liquid shadow, her aged body suddenly possessed of a terrible grace that defied physics and reason. Her hand shot out, fingers rigid, and struck the guard's throat in exactly the place where Zarthulian physiology placed a cluster of nerves that controlled their respiratory system. The massive warrior stumbled, choking, and Elena was already moving, using his falling body as a springboard to launch herself at the second guard. She twisted in midair, borrowed the guard's own plasma rifle with a movement so smooth it looked like the weapon had simply decided to change owners, and fired 3 shots that found the weak points in chitin armor that most beings didn't even know existed. The throne room, still processing what was happening, erupted into chaos. The remaining 4 guards converged on her position, but Elena was no longer where she had been. She rolled under a strike that would have decapitated her, came up inside the guard's reach, and did something with her elbow that made a sound like snapping timber. The guard's arm bent in a direction nature had never intended, and his own blade, suddenly freed, found its way into his companion's optical cluster with the precision of practiced murder. The nobles were screaming now, scrambling for exits, their bravery evaporating in the face of actual violence. Vorshak's rose from his throne, all 4 arms reaching for weapons that he had not needed to draw in decades. But his eyes were fixed on the old woman who moved through his guards like a reaper through wheat, and for the first time in his long and brutal life, he felt something he had not experienced since he was young: fear. This was not possible. Terrans were weak, their bodies fragile, their combat abilities primitive. Yet this woman moved like death itself, every motion economical, every strike lethal, wasting no energy on flourish or showmanship. She fought the way glaciers moved, the way stars died, with terrible inevitable purpose. The 5th guard managed to get a shot off, a plasma bolt that should have vaporized her torso. Elena somehow wasn't there, had moved a fraction of a second before the trigger pull, and the bolt took the 6th guard in the chest instead. She used the moment of confusion to close distance, and her hands, those aged hands that had signed peace treaties and shaken with presidents, found pressure points and nerve clusters that made the guard's own body betray him. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, alive but completely paralyzed. The last guard, the largest and most decorated, backed away with his weapon raised but his hands shaking. Elena stood among the bodies of his companions, not even breathing hard, a slight sheen of sweat the only sign she had exerted herself at all. She looked at him with those terrible eyes and said, in his own language which she apparently spoke fluently, that he should lower his weapon and step aside. That he was a soldier following orders, and soldiers who were just doing their duty did not need to die today. The guard looked to his king, found no guidance in Vorshak's stunned expression, and made the wisest decision of his life. He dropped his weapon and retreated to the edge of the chamber. Elena nodded once, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, then turned her attention back to the king. The throne room had emptied of nobles, leaving only Vorshak's, his remaining guards who were smart enough to stay back, and the old woman who had just demonstrated that humanity's weakness had been greatly exaggerated. Vorshak found his voice, though it came out rougher than he would have liked. He demanded to know what she was, what kind of creature could move like that, kill like that, be like that. Elena picked up her data pad from where she had carefully set it, dusted it off with gentle fingers, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ghost stories and cautionary tales. She told him that before she was a diplomat, before she spent her twilight years talking and negotiating and trying to prevent wars, she had been something else. The Terran government, in its wisdom or its desperation, had created a program so classified that it officially did not exist. They had taken soldiers, the ones who were too good at killing, too comfortable with violence, too willing to do what needed to be done, and they had made them into something more. Something worse. Enhanced reflexes, accelerated healing, pain tolerance beyond normal human limits, tactical processing that bordered on precognition. But mostly, they had simply given these soldiers permission to be the monsters that civilization usually kept leashed. They had been sent to places where official forces could not go, to do things that governments needed done but could never acknowledge. They had toppled regimes and eliminated threats and walked through security that was supposed to be impenetrable. And when the job was particularly impossible, when the target was particularly dangerous, when success seemed beyond reach, they sent her. The other operatives in the program had called her Baba Yaga, after the witch from old Russian folklore who lived in a house that walked on chicken legs and who could not be escaped once she had marked you for death. The name stuck. For 30 years, she had been the nightmare that warlords whispered about, the reason that certain very bad people suddenly stopped being problems. Dictators who vanished from supposedly secure bunkers. Terrorists who died in impossible accidents. Criminal lords who went to sleep surrounded by guards and never woke up. The intelligence communities of a dozen nations knew the name, though none of them could prove who she really was. Baba Yaga, the assassin who could not be stopped, could not be caught, could not be killed. And then, one day, she had decided she was done. The program was shut down, officially dissolved, its operatives retired or reassigned. Elena Volkov had chosen a new path, had decided to use her remaining years building peace instead of destroying enemies. She had been a genuinely good diplomat for 20 years, had negotiated treaties and prevented wars and done real, meaningful good in the galaxy. But retirement did not mean forgetting, and the skills that had made her Baba Yaga never truly faded. They were just sleeping, waiting for the moment when talking failed and the old ways became necessary again. Vorshak understood now, saw with terrible clarity the mistake he had made. He had thought to intimidate humanity by threatening their diplomat, had believed that killing her would demonstrate his power and break their spirit. Instead, he had awakened something that should have remained sleeping, had reminded the galaxy that humanity, for all its talk of peace and civilization, still carried the capacity for exquisite violence in its DNA. Elena walked toward the throne, her steps measured and calm, and Vorshak, who had conquered star systems and brought civilizations to heel, found himself unable to move. She climbed the steps to his throne with the same ease she had shown walking the length of his hall, and when she stood before him, she was close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender perfume she wore, absurdly domestic and human. She told him, in a voice that carried absolute certainty, that he had 48 hours to withdraw his fleets from Terran space. That if a single shot was fired at Earth, if a single human died because of his arrogance, she would return to Zartholos. And when she did, she would not be coming as a diplomat. She would be coming as Baba Yaga, and she would kill him in his sleep, in his throne room, in his most secure facility, wherever he tried to hide. She would kill his generals, his admirals, his heirs and counselors. She would dismantle his empire one assassination at a time until nothing remained but a cautionary tale about the folly of threatening humanity. The king tried to salvage his pride, his voice booming through the chamber as he declared that no single being, no matter how skilled, could threaten an empire. That he had armies, fleets, billions of subjects who would hunt her to the ends of the galaxy. That she was one woman, aged and alone, and he was the ruler of 17 star systems. Elena smiled again, that same terrible smile, and told him he was absolutely right. She was one woman. But she was not alone, had never truly been alone. Did he really think that humanity had created only one Baba Yaga? That the program had produced just a single operative? There were others, some retired like her, some still active in ways that governments would never acknowledge. They had scattered across human space, had become teachers and merchants and yes, diplomats. But they remembered their training, remembered what they had been, and if Earth fell, if humanity was pushed to the edge of extinction, they would remember how to be monsters again. And more than that, she told him, did he understand what would happen to his empire if humanity was destroyed? The other species in the galaxy, the ones currently neutral in this dispute, were watching closely. They saw how the Zartholian Empire dealt with younger species, saw the brutality and the threats and the demands for submission. Many of them had their own Baba Yagas, their own dark operatives and assassins, their own capacity for violence that civilization kept carefully controlled. If Vorshax massacred humanity for refusing to submit, he would send a message to every other species in the galaxy, submit or die. And some of them, the proud ones, the strong ones, the ones with their own warrior traditions, would choose to die fighting. He would unite the galaxy against him, would create enemies where there had been only caution. More than that, Elena continued, her voice dropping to something almost conversational, he would prove that peaceful coexistence was impossible, that negotiation was futile, that the only language that mattered in the cosmos was violence. And if that became the accepted truth, if civilization decided that might truly did make right, then humanity would adapt. Humans were good at adapting, had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to survive in a world that wanted them dead. They had climbed from caves to space in the blink of cosmic time, had gone from stone tools to fusion reactors in a few thousand years. If the galaxy taught them that peace was a lie and violence was the only truth, they would become very, very good at violence. They would learn, would iterate, would innovate the way they always did when faced with an existential threat. In a generation, maybe two, humanity would be producing weapons and warriors that would make the current Terran military look primitive. They would turn their entire civilization into a war machine, would breed and train and augment soldiers until every human was a potential threat. And the Baba Yagas, the ones like Elena who currently chose diplomacy over death, would stop choosing. They would teach the younger generation everything they knew, would pass on the skills and techniques and cold equations of professional murder, and the galaxy would drown in blood. Was that what Vorshax wanted? Did he want his legacy to be the king who taught humanity that peace was for fools? Elena stepped back, giving the king space to process what she had said, to understand the choice before him. She could see his mind working, could almost hear the calculations he was making. The king was many things, brutal and arrogant and cruel, but he was not stupid. He had not conquered 17 star systems by being unable to recognize when the tactical situation had shifted against him. He looked at the old woman standing before him, at the bodies of his guards, at the empty throne room that should have been full of nobles witnessing humanity's submission. He thought about his fleets orbiting Earth, about the orders that had not yet been given, about the future that branched in two directions from this moment. One path led to the annihilation of humanity and the creation of enemies across the galaxy. The other path led to something unprecedented, a voluntary withdrawal, a king backing down from a threat, an empire showing restraint. Both paths carried risks. Both would change how the galaxy saw the Zartholian Empire. But one path led to endless war, and the other led to an uncertain peace, and Vorshax, for all his pride, was wise enough to know which option would let his empire survive. He stood from his throne, all four arms coming to rest at his sides, and looked down at Elena Volkov with something that might have been respect. He told her that he would consider her counteroffer, that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about humanity's resolve. Elena knew a face-saving retreat when she saw one, had given enough powerful beings the chance to back down gracefully that she recognized the pattern. She nodded once, accepting the fiction, giving him the room he needed to change course without admitting defeat. She said that humanity would be pleased to establish proper diplomatic relations with the Zartholian Empire, that there need be no hostility between their peoples, that the galaxy was large enough for both civilizations to thrive. She spoke the formal words of diplomacy, gave him the script he could use to explain the withdrawal to his court, made it easy for him to do the right thing. Vorshax listened, and in the silence that followed her words, made his decision. He would withdraw the fleets. Not immediately, that would look too much like retreat, but gradually over the next 48 hours, citing the need to redeploy forces to other borders. He would release a statement about humanity's unexpected resilience, about the value of having humanity as an ally rather than subjugating them as vassals. His court would whisper about weakness, but his generals would understand that sometimes the strongest move was knowing when not to fight. And in the privacy of his own thoughts, he would remember the old woman who had killed 6 of his best guards and then offered him peace, and he would be grateful that he had been wise enough to accept. Elena bowed slightly, proper diplomatic courtesy restored now that the understanding had been reached. She retrieved her data pad, turned, and began the long walk back across the throne room. Behind her, she heard Vorshax calling for his guards to retrieve their fallen comrades, his voice carefully controlled. She did not look back. She had learned long ago that when you made an exit, you made it clean, with no hesitation or doubt. She walked through corridors that had been cleared of nobles, past guards who watched her with new wariness, back to her shuttle where her pilot waited with weapons charged and escape vectors plotted. The pilot, a young man who had been terrified when he heard weapons fire from the throne room, nearly collapsed with relief when he saw her alive. He asked, voice shaking, what had happened in there. Elena told him that diplomacy had prevailed, that the king had seen reason, that the fleets would be withdrawing. She did not mention the bodies, the violence, the moment when talking had failed and older skills had become necessary. Some things were better left in throne rooms and classified files, better left as stories that people might half believe, rumors that could never be confirmed. The shuttle lifted from Zartholos with none of the ceremony that had marked its arrival. Elena sat in the passenger compartment, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that came after combat, the crash that always followed when adrenaline faded and the body remembered it was 73 years old. Her hands shook slightly, a tremor she would not have permitted anyone to see, and she clasped them together in her lap until they stilled. She had not lied to the king about anything except one small detail. She had said she was not alone, that there were other Baba Yagas scattered across human space. That was true. What she had not mentioned was how few of them remained. The program had produced 12 operatives over its 30-year existence. 5 had died in the field, killed by enemies who got lucky or situations that even their skills could not overcome. 2 had died in retirement, their bodies finally giving out after years of abuse and enhancement. 3 had vanished, gone so deep underground that even their former handlers could not find them, living lives completely disconnected from their past. That left only 2, Elena herself and one other, a man who ran a small restaurant on a colony world and who had told her, the last time they spoke, that he would never pick up a weapon again for any reason. She was, for all practical purposes, the last Baba Yaga, the final monster from humanity's desperate attempt to create super soldiers who could operate outside the normal rules of warfare. And she had just gambled everything, her life and possibly Earth's survival, on a bluff that the king might have called. If he had been willing to test her threat, if he had ordered his fleets to fire on Earth, she would have made good on her promise to hunt him down. But one woman, no matter how skilled, could not stop an empire. She could have killed Vorshax, could have probably eliminated most of his high command, could have created enough chaos and fear to destabilize the Zartholian Empire for years. But Earth would still have burned. Her people would still have died. In the end, her bluff had worked because the king had enough imagination to fear what she represented, enough wisdom to recognize that some fights were not worth winning. She had bet correctly on his character, and humanity would survive because a brutal alien king had proven smarter than she had any right to hope. The shuttle cleared Zartholian space and made the jump to faster-than-light travel, carrying her back toward Sol System. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done, the lives she had taken, the violence she had promised herself she would never engage in again. She had spent 20 years trying to be better than Baba Yaga, trying to prove that she could build peace instead of delivering death. And in one terrible moment, she had reverted to the monster she had been, had killed with the same cold efficiency that had made her name a whispered nightmare. Was it worth it? If her actions saved Earth, saved the billions of humans who went about their lives unaware of how close they had come to annihilation, then yes, it was worth it. But there was a cost, always a cost, paid in the pieces of your soul that you could never get back. She had thought those pieces were already gone, burned away during 30 years of sanctioned murder, but apparently there was still something in her capable of feeling guilt, still some small part that mourned the necessity of violence even when that violence was justified. It was, she supposed, a sign that she had not completely lost her humanity despite everything she had done. The communication system chimed, indicating an incoming message from Earth. Elena activated it, expecting a transmission from the diplomatic corps demanding a situation report. Instead, the face that appeared on the screen was Director Sarah Chen of Terran Intelligence, one of the few people who knew exactly who Elena Volkov had been before she became a diplomat. The director's expression was carefully neutral, but Elena could read the tension around her eyes, the set of her jaw that meant she had been watching the situation closely. She asked, without preamble, if the mission had been successful. Elena confirmed that the Zartholian fleets would be withdrawing, that the immediate threat to Earth had been resolved through diplomatic channels. The director's eyes narrowed slightly at the phrase, diplomatic channels, clearly understanding that diplomacy had probably involved more than just talking. She asked if there had been complications. Elena considered how to answer that, how much to reveal about what had happened in Vorshax's throne room. Finally, she said that the king had initially been unreceptive to negotiation, but that she had managed to persuade him that humanity's submission was not inevitable. The director was quiet for a moment, studying Elena's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading people. Then she said, carefully, that preliminary reports indicated there had been casualties in the royal palace, that Zartholian internal communications were referencing an incident during the diplomatic meeting. Elena did not bother to deny it, simply met the director's gaze and said that sometimes diplomatic incidents occurred, and that the important thing was the outcome. The director nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer, and said that the diplomatic corps would be issuing a statement about the successful negotiation, about Ambassador Volkov's skilled handling of a difficult situation. There would be no mention of violence, no official acknowledgement of anything beyond standard diplomatic protocol. Elena's record would remain clean, her reputation as a peacemaker intact. But the director wanted Elena to know, wanted to say clearly, that there were people in the government who understood what she had done, who knew what it had cost her, and who were grateful even if that gratitude could never be public. Elena felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly at those words. It was not forgiveness, she had done nothing that required forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the choices she had made were not easy ones, that reverting to old skills had not been done lightly, that being Baba Yaga again, even briefly, had required sacrifice. The director asked one more question, her voice gentler now: was Elena all right? It was a simple question, the kind that people asked each other casually, but coming from the director it carried weight. She was asking if Elena could come back from this, if the diplomat could survive the assassin's return, if the woman who had spent 20 years building peace could live with having delivered death once more. Elena considered the question seriously, looking inward to assess the damage. She was tired, shaken, older than she had felt in years. But she was also still herself, still the woman who believed that peace was worth fighting for, that civilization was worth preserving, that there was a difference between necessary violence and cruelty. She told the director that she would be fine, that she had made her choice and would live with it, that she regretted the necessity but not the action. The director seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least willing to accept it, and signed off with instructions for Elena to report to headquarters for a full debriefing once she reached Earth. The shuttle continued its journey home, carrying Elena through the vast darkness between stars. She sat alone with her thoughts, with the ghosts of the people she had been, the young soldier who had volunteered for the program, the Baba Yaga who had walked through shadows and ended lives, the diplomat who had tried to be better than her past. All of them were her, all of them were real, and she had learned to carry all of them without letting any single identity destroy the others. It was not easy, would never be easy, but it was possible. She thought about the young people who would join the diplomatic corps in the coming years, who would negotiate with alien species and try to prevent wars. Some of them would face situations like the one she had just navigated, moments when talking failed and harder choices became necessary. She hoped they would be better prepared than she had been, hoped that humanity would find ways to protect its diplomats without requiring them to also be warriors. But she also understood, with the clarity that came from experience, that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be capable of war. That showing strength was not the opposite of diplomacy but sometimes its necessary foundation. That the galaxy respected those who could defend themselves, and that humanity's survival might depend on never appearing weak even when pursuing peace. Elena's shuttle reached Earth 3 days later, dropping from faster-than-light travel near Jupiter and making the long sublight journey to the inner system. She watched through the viewport as her homeworld grew from a blue marble to a living planet, clouds swirling across familiar continents, city lights twinkling on the night side. Somewhere down there, billions of people were going about their lives, completely unaware that they had been days away from annihilation, saved by an old woman who had reminded an alien king that humanity was more dangerous than it appeared. She wondered how history would record this moment, if anyone would ever know the truth of what happened in Vorshax's throne room, or if it would become another classified file buried in intelligence archives. Probably the latter. The truth was often too complicated, too dark, too uncomfortable for public consumption. Better to let people believe in clean diplomatic victories, in the power of words and reason, in a universe where violence was the exception rather than the rule. Let them have their illusions. Let them sleep peacefully. That was what people like Elena existed for, to handle the darkness so others could live in the light. The shuttle landed at Geneva Spaceport, and Elena was immediately whisked away to a secure facility for debriefing. She spent 6 hours answering questions, recounting every detail of the mission with the precision that her training demanded. The analysts wanted to know everything: the king's body language, the exact words used, the court's reaction, the technical specifications of the weapons the guards had carried. She gave them everything except the parts that were purely internal, the emotional landscape of returning to violence, the cost that could not be measured in tactical assessments. When the debriefing finally ended, when the analysts were satisfied that they had extracted every useful piece of information, Elena was released with commendations for her service and instructions to take a few weeks of personal leave. The assistant director who delivered this news, a younger woman who had not yet learned to hide her emotions behind bureaucratic professionalism, looked at Elena with something approaching awe. She said that what Elena had done was remarkable, that she had saved Earth through a combination of courage and skill that would be studied for years. Elena thanked her politely but felt the words land wrong somehow. She had not felt courageous in that throne room, had not felt like a hero. She had felt like a killer doing what killers do, like a weapon being deployed for a specific purpose. The fact that the outcome was good did not change what she had been in that moment. She left the facility as the sun was setting, painting Geneva in gold and crimson light. No one stopped her, no media ambush or public recognition. As far as the world knew, Ambassador Volkov had successfully negotiated a withdrawal of hostile forces through standard diplomatic means. She caught a train to Zurich, then a local transport to the small apartment she maintained in the old city. It was a simple place, 2 rooms with a view of the river, filled with books and comfortable furniture and photographs of people she had known over the years. She made tea in a kettle that was older than most nations, sat by the window, and allowed herself to simply exist without purpose or duty for the first time in weeks. The tea was Earl Grey, the same blend she had been drinking since she was young, and the familiar taste grounded her, reminded her of who she was beneath all the identities and roles. Just Elena. Just a woman who had lived too long and seen too much, who carried scars that most people could never imagine, who had chosen to spend her remaining years trying to make the galaxy a slightly less terrible place. The message arrived 3 days into her leave, a simple text from an unlisted number. It said only, "Heard you danced. Hope you're okay. V." Elena stared at it for a long moment, recognizing the sender. Vasily, the other surviving Baba Yaga, the man who ran a restaurant on Cygnus 4 and who had supposedly left the life completely behind. Apparently, word had spread through old networks, whispered among people who understood what dancing meant in their peculiar vocabulary. She typed a response, equally brief, rusty but functional. "Retirement still suits you?" The reply came quickly, "Every day. But I'd come if you needed me." Elena felt unexpected emotion at those words, at the knowledge that she was not as alone as she sometimes felt. She responded, "I know. Stay where you are. Be happy. Someone should be." There was a long pause, then, "You too, Elena. You deserve peace." She did not know how to respond to that, did not know if she believed it, so she simply sent back a heart emoji and closed the connection. The weeks passed slowly, filled with nothing more dramatic than morning walks along the river and evening reading in her comfortable chair. Elena found herself thinking about retirement, about whether she could truly walk away from diplomatic service, whether she could trust others to handle the delicate negotiations that kept humanity safe. She was 73, had given 50 years of her life to serving Earth in various capacities, had earned the right to rest. But she also knew herself well enough to recognize that rest had never come easily to her, that purpose was what kept her moving forward, that being useful was how she justified the continued existence of someone who had done such terrible things. Eventually, as her leave drew to an end, she made her decision. She would continue as a diplomat for as long as they would have her, would use the skills she had developed over 2 decades of negotiation and compromise. But she would also maintain the other skills, the ones from her darker past, because the galaxy had proven that sometimes talking was not enough. She would be both the diplomat and the Baba Yaga, would carry both identities and use whichever one was needed. It was not a burden she would have chosen, but it was the one she carried, and she would carry it with as much grace as she could manage. On the morning of her final day of leave, Elena woke early and took a long walk through the old city. The streets of Zurich were quiet at dawn, just a few early commuters and delivery workers going about their business. She walked past buildings that had stood for centuries, past monuments to conflicts that most people had forgotten, past the ordinary miracles of civilization that continued despite the darkness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm everything. She stopped at a small memorial in a park, a simple stone dedicated to those who had served in ways that could never be acknowledged, whose sacrifices would never be recorded in history books. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the guards she had killed in Vorshak's throne room, about all the others she had killed over 30 years of sanctioned violence, about the price that peace demanded and whether she had paid enough or would ever be able to pay enough. A young mother passed by with a child, the little girl laughing at something only she understood, and Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from knowing what she had protected, what she would continue to protect for as long as she was able. She returned to her apartment to find another message waiting, this one official. The diplomatic corps was requesting her presence for a ceremony, something about a commendation for distinguished service. Elena almost declined, had no interest in standing on a stage while people who didn't know the truth applauded her for things she wished she hadn't had to do. But then she thought about the young diplomats who would be there, the ones just starting their careers, the ones who still believed that words could change the world. Maybe they needed to see that diplomacy worked, that negotiation could prevent wars, that there were alternatives to violence. Even if the reality was more complicated than they knew, even if sometimes the diplomat had to be more than just a diplomat, the belief in peace was still worth nurturing. She sent her acceptance and spent the afternoon pressing her dress uniform, the one with the medals she had earned for missions she could never discuss and negotiations that had prevented conflicts most people never knew had been possible. The ceremony was held in the main hall of the Diplomatic Corps headquarters, a beautiful space with high ceilings and walls lined with the flags of Earth's nations and the emblems of humanity's colonies. Elena stood with a dozen other diplomats being honored, listening to speeches about service and dedication and the noble work of building bridges between species. When her name was called, when she walked to the podium to receive her commendation, she looked out at the audience and saw faces young and old, humans who had chosen to serve not with weapons but with words, who believed in the possibility of understanding across the vast gulfs of biology and culture. The Secretary General, a dignified man who had held his position for 15 years and who knew at least some of what Elena had done on Zartholos, shook her hand and presented her with a crystal award etched with Earth and the stars. He spoke briefly about her decades of service, about the recent successful negotiation with the Zartholian Empire, about how her courage and skill had prevented a war that could have cost billions of lives. The audience applauded, standing, and Elena accepted their recognition with a small bow, knowing that they were applauding a fiction, a simplified version of events that let them sleep at night. After the ceremony, as people mingled and congratulated each other, a young woman approached Elena. She was maybe 25, fresh out of the diplomatic academy, her eyes bright with idealism and determination. She introduced herself as Junior Attaché Maria Santos and said that she had written her thesis on conflict resolution in asymmetric power dynamics, using some of Elena's earlier negotiations as case studies. She asked, with the directness of youth, how Elena had managed to convince the Zartholian king to back down when he held all the military advantages. What words had she used? What arguments had proven decisive? How did you make someone see reason when they were convinced of their own superiority? Elena looked at this young woman, so eager and hopeful, and felt the weight of the lies she would have to tell. She could not say that words alone had not been enough, that violence had been necessary, that sometimes the only language power understood was greater power. That would shatter something important in Maria, would plant seeds of cynicism that might grow into the kind of darkness that had consumed too many good people. So instead, Elena told her a truth that was incomplete but not entirely false. She said that the key was understanding what your opponent truly valued, what they feared losing, and then showing them a path forward that protected those interests better than conflict would. That you had to speak to their rational self-interest while also appealing to whatever honor or principle they held, however alien those principles might be. That patience was a weapon more powerful than any threat, and that sometimes the strongest negotiating position was the willingness to walk away. Maria absorbed this with the intensity of someone taking notes for a future textbook, and Elena felt a pang of something like guilt mixed with hope. The young woman would go out into the galaxy armed with principles and training and genuine desire to make things better, and sometimes those tools would be enough. Probably most of the time, they would be enough. And on the occasions when they weren't, when the situation demanded more than diplomacy could provide, there would be people like Elena in the background, people who could do the things that idealists should never have to do. It was not a perfect system, was morally complicated in ways that philosophers would debate forever, but it was the system that had kept humanity alive thus far, and Elena would continue to be part of it for as long as she was needed. She wished Maria well, encouraged her to stay true to her principles, and meant it sincerely even as she knew that the galaxy was more complicated and more dangerous than the young diplomat yet understood. The call came on her last day of leave, exactly as Elena had known it would. The diplomatic corps never let their best people rest for long, and after the success on Zartholos, she was definitely considered one of their best. Ambassador Volkov was requested to take on a new assignment, mediating a territorial dispute between two species on the edge of human space. The conflict had been simmering for years, threats and counter-threats escalating toward inevitable violence. Both species had pride and legitimate grievances, both felt their survival was at stake, and neither trusted human mediation but were willing to accept it as preferable to war. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that Elena specialized in, the kind where failure meant thousands or millions of deaths and success meant a fragile peace that would require constant maintenance. She accepted the assignment without hesitation, began reviewing the briefing materials even before the official paperwork was processed. This was who she was now, who she had chosen to be, the diplomat who walked into impossible situations armed with nothing but words and experience and the secret knowledge that if words failed, if the situation became truly desperate, she had other options. She hoped she would never need those options again, but she was no longer naive enough to believe that hope alone would keep her safe. As her shuttle lifted from Earth 3 days later, carrying her toward another crisis on another world, Elena looked down at her home planet and felt the familiar mixture of love and sorrow that had defined most of her adult life. Down there, billions of people lived and loved and built their futures, most of them good people doing their best in a complicated universe. They deserved protection, deserved the chance to live without fear of alien invasion or galactic war, deserved leaders and diplomats and yes, even hidden warriors who would do whatever was necessary to keep them safe. Elena had been many things in her 73 years: daughter, soldier, assassin, diplomat, survivor. She had killed and saved lives, had made choices that haunted her and choices she would make again without hesitation. She was not perfect, was not even particularly good by some measures, but she was trying. Trying to build peace where peace was possible, trying to prevent the wars that could be prevented, trying to make the galaxy a little less hostile for the species that had produced her. And when trying wasn't enough, when the darkness came calling and words failed and violence became necessary, she would put aside the diplomat suit and remember how to be Baba Yaga one more time. Because that was the bargain she had made with herself, with her conscience, with the ghosts of everyone she had killed and everyone she had saved. She would carry both identities, would be both the builder and the destroyer, would walk the line between civilization and savagery for as long as her body held out and her mind remained clear. The shuttle jumped to faster-than-light speed, and Earth vanished into the impossible geometries of hyperspace. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of rest before arriving at her next assignment, her next impossible negotiation, her next chance to prove that peace was worth fighting for. She was Ambassador Elena Volkov, diplomat extraordinaire, defender of human interests, bridge builder between species. And when needed, when all other options were exhausted and the darkness pressed too close, she was also Baba Yaga, the witch from old stories who could not be escaped, the nightmare that made monsters think twice. She was both, would always be both, and the galaxy was slowly learning that humanity sent its best people to negotiate peace, and its most dangerous people looked exactly the same. Let them learn. Let them whisper her name in their own languages, let them tell stories about the old woman who had killed 6 guards and made a king back down, let the legend grow. Because sometimes, the best deterrent to war was not military might or technological superiority, but the knowledge that humanity had individuals who could walk into your throne room, survive your assassination attempt, and make you understand that threatening Earth was the last mistake you would ever be allowed to make. Elena Volkov would continue to be that deterrent, that warning, that last line of defense. Not because she wanted to be, not because she enjoyed it, but because someone had to stand in the gap between humanity and the darkness, and she had proven she could survive there. So she would stand for as long as she was needed, would negotiate and threaten and kill if necessary, would carry the burden that others should never have to carry. It was not the life she would have chosen for herself, but it was the life she had, and she would live it with as much honor and grace as someone with blood on their hands could manage. The shuttle carried her into the unknown, toward another crisis, another chance to prove that humanity's strength lay not just in its weapons or its words, but in individuals willing to be both diplomat and warrior, builder and destroyer, peacemaker and, when absolutely necessary, death incarnate.